Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The first officer through the door slipped on blood, smeared across concrete in overlapping arcs that showed movement under pressure. The floor of the abandoned slaughterhouse was slick enough that the officer had to catch himself on a rusted rail to stay upright. The smell hit a second later, iron-heavy and warm despite the cold air, layered with ammonia and rot that had seeped into the building over decades. The body lay in the kill room. Nathan Brooks was face down, arms pulled behind him at an angle that suggested they had been forced there long before death. His shirt had been cut open, not torn, exposing his back. The skin was flayed in two places, shallow but deliberate, as if someone had wanted pain without speed. His head had been struck repeatedly, not hard enough to shatter the skull at first, but often enough to leave the face unrecognizable by the time it ended. This had not been loss of control, this had been work. The slaughterhouse sat outside Pueblo, Colorado, a concrete carcass left behind when the industry moved on. Teenagers sometimes broke in to drink. Scrappers stripped what they could reach. No one came here at night unless they had a reason to believe no one else would. Nathan Brooks had come here willingly. Detective Laura Hensley arrived just after midnight. Floodlights lit the yard, turning tall grass silver and flat. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, taking in the geometry of violence. Brooks had been moved, dragged from one end of the room to the other. His shoes were missing. His socks had been pulled off and thrown aside, soaked through and discarded like rags. Bare feet left marks. Hensley followed them. The footprints staggered, curved, doubled back. Brooks had tried to stand. He had failed. The pattern ended near a floor drain clogged with hair and debris. Blood had been pushed toward it with a boot heel, not to clean, but to control spread. Someone had cared about time. Brooks was 39 years old. His record was thin. Assault charges in his 20s, dismissed. A fraud case that never went to trial. Employment that shifted often but always circled the same orbit. Warehouses. Security. Night supervision. Jobs that paid extra for silence. His phone was gone. His wallet was still in his pocket. That detail settled heavily with Hensley. A gas station camera 10 miles down the highway showed Brooks less than an hour before his death. He stood at the counter drinking an energy drink, jaw tight, eyes scanning the windows. He paid cash. He did not linger. He did not look like a man on his way to meet friends. He looked like a man bracing himself. The clerk remembered him clearly. Brooks had asked whether anyone ever came out to the slaughterhouse anymore. The question had been casual, almost joking. The clerk said no, not really. Brooks nodded, finished his drink, and left. Hensley replayed that footage until it lost motion and became posture. Brooks had known where he was going. He had known what kind of place it was. That suggested either desperation or obligation. The medical examiner arrived just before dawn and worked in silence. The injuries told a precise story. Brooks had been beaten, restrained, cut, beaten again. He had not died quickly. The final blows came only after his body had exhausted itself. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but the timing suggested something else mattered more than the ending. Someone had wanted Brooks to endure. Hensley stepped outside as the sun began to lift, pale and weak. The land around the slaughterhouse was flat and empty, broken only by fencing and old access roads. Tire tracks were visible near the loading dock, fresh and narrow, likely from a pickup. The tracks entered and exited cleanly. No hesitation, no spin. This was not a dump site. It was a destination. Back at the station, Hensley pulled Brooks's recent history. He had been working short-term contracts for a private security firm that specialized in overnight coverage for decommissioned industrial sites. The work was legal, boring, and required minimal oversight. It also provided keys, codes, and the ability to notice things without being noticed. Brooks had been fired 3 days before his death. The termination note was brief. Violation of protocol. Failure to report irregular activity. No elaboration. Hensley interviewed Brooks's supervisor, a man who spoke carefully and avoided eye contact. He insisted Brooks had been unreliable, prone to improvisation. He did not express sadness. He expressed relief. When Hensley asked whether Brooks had access to sensitive locations, the supervisor corrected her gently. There was nothing sensitive about abandoned buildings. They were empty. Hensley did not argue. She simply wrote it down. Later that afternoon, a search team found Brooks's shoes in a trash bin behind a storage facility 6 miles away. They had been rinsed, but traces of blood remained in the stitching. The bin also contained zip ties, cut cleanly, and a pair of work gloves turned inside out. The gloves were Brooks's size. Hensley understood then that Brooks had not been ambushed. He had been involved, at least initially. He had come prepared. The violence escalated when something went wrong, or when something was refused. Phone records provided a final piece. Brooks had received a call shortly before leaving the gas station. The number was blocked. The call lasted 30 seconds, long enough to confirm location, short enough to avoid discussion. Hensley stood again in the kill room that evening, alone now, the body removed, the blood darkening as it dried. The marks on the floor were still readable. The story was still there, written in movement and restraint. Nathan Brooks had not died because someone lost control. He had died because control had been reasserted. Whatever Brooks knew, whatever he had failed to report, whatever line he had crossed or tried to step back over, it had been answered here, in a place built for ending things efficiently and without witnesses. The investigation was just beginning, but the tone had already been set. This was not a case that would resolve cleanly. It was a case designed to teach a lesson, and Brooks had been made to absorb it with his body. The slaughterhouse was sealed by noon, but the damage had already escaped its walls. Detective Laura Hensley spent the morning reconstructing movement. The tire tracks near the loading dock were measured, photographed, and cast. They belonged to an older pickup, heavy enough to sit low in the rear, the tread worn unevenly from long highway miles. The vehicle had backed in cleanly, aligned with the dock as if it had done so before. This was not someone guessing in the dark. Inside, technicians cataloged the smaller details. A tooth fragment near the drain, a fleck of dried blood on a ceiling pipe, placed there by an upward strike, a partial boot print that did not match Brooks's footwear, its sole pattern consistent with industrial work boots sold at regional supply stores. Common, replaceable, forgettable. Hensley watched the process without intervening. She preferred to let violence speak in its own order. Patterns emerged when they were not rushed. Brooks's termination became the axis of the case. The private security firm, Mesa Shield Solutions, operated out of a low-concrete office park on the outskirts of Pueblo. Their contracts were legitimate, their paperwork clean, their staffing fluid. They hired men like Brooks often. Men with flexible morals, short memories, and the ability to stay awake through empty nights. Hensley visited the office that afternoon. The receptionist did not recognize Brooks's name at first. When Hensley showed her a photo, recognition arrived without emotion. Brooks had been difficult, the receptionist said. He asked too many questions. He wrote too much down. He treated empty buildings like they were occupied by something that wanted privacy. That phrasing lingered with Hensley. Brooks's supervisor repeated the same explanation as before, but with more detail under pressure. Brooks had been assigned to monitor a decommissioned cold storage facility near the rail spur east of town. The site was supposed to be empty, pending demolition. Brooks reported movement inside the building during his second week. Lights, sounds, equipment that should not have been there. The supervisor told him to ignore it. When Brooks persisted, filing written reports rather than verbal ones, the tone changed. He was reminded that the company did not investigate. It observed. If something required escalation, it came from clients, not guards. Brooks did not adjust. He was fired the following Monday. Phone records showed that Brooks made 3 calls that day to numbers associated with freight brokers and warehouse managers. None of the calls lasted long. None of them resulted in return contact. It appeared Brooks had been looking for someone who would listen. No one had. Hensley drove to the cold storage facility just before sunset. The building sat back from the road, its windows boarded, its exterior marked with peeling warning signs. It looked abandoned in the way things often did when they were meant to discourage curiosity. The padlock on the side door was new. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. Generators hummed somewhere out of sight. Temporary lighting illuminated a section of the floor where shipping containers had been arranged in rows. The containers were unmarked, their surfaces clean, their seals intact. This was not abandonment. It was concealment. Hensley did not touch anything. She photographed, noted, and left. She understood now why Brooks had been a problem. He had stumbled into a place that required silence, and he had refused to supply it. Back at the station, she reviewed Brooks's final hours again. The call before the gas station. The question to the clerk. The drive to the slaughterhouse. It read like compliance, not panic. Brooks had been summoned and had gone, because refusing would have felt worse than showing up. The brutality suggested punishment layered over necessity. Brooks had not only failed to stay quiet, he had attempted to involve others. That kind of behavior threatened exposure. Hensley received a call just after midnight from a patrol unit responding to a noise complaint near the rail spur. When officers arrived, the cold storage facility was dark. The generators were silent. The containers were gone. The site had been emptied in less than 12 hours. Hensley stood alone in the evidence room later that night, looking at photographs of Brooks's injuries. The cuts, the restraints, the methodical escalation. This was violence administered by people who understood sequence. Pain first, information second, finality last. Nathan Brooks had not been killed to make him disappear. He had been killed to make sure the message reached anyone else who might notice what he noticed. The investigation was no longer about a single death. It was about a moving operation that treated human attention as its greatest threat. And it was still moving. Once the containers vanished, the investigation accelerated in ways that felt both urgent and futile. Detective Laura Hensley requested aerial surveys of the surrounding freight corridors, but by the time authorization came through, the trail had already cooled. Whatever had been stored in the cold facility was mobile by design. It did not linger. It passed through places that existed precisely because they were meant to be temporary. Hensley returned to Brooks's phone records again, this time mapping not who he called, but when. The pattern sharpened. Brooks had begun making late-night calls only after his second week at the cold storage site. The calls clustered after his shifts, during the hours when doubt tended to harden into resolve. He had not been asking for money or favors. He had been asking questions. That made him dangerous. The first real crack came from an emergency room nurse in La Junta, 2 hours southeast. She called in after seeing Brooks's photo circulated internally. The night Brooks was fired, a man had come in with a fractured hand and severe bruising along his forearms. The injuries were consistent with striking hard surfaces repeatedly and restraining someone who resisted. The man claimed he fell off a ladder. The nurse did not believe him. Security footage showed the man leaving the hospital parking lot in an older pickup with a damaged rear suspension. The license plate was partially obscured by mud, but the color and body shape matched the tire impressions at the slaughterhouse. Hensley tracked the plate fragment to a contractor named Victor Raines. Raines was not a killer by reputation. He was a logistics fixer, a man who solved problems that paperwork could not. He specialized in temporary labor, off-books transport, and expedited clear-outs. When sites needed to be emptied overnight, Raines was called. When people needed to be discouraged from noticing, he handled that too, indirectly. Hensley located Raines at a roadside bar near the state line. She did not approach him immediately. She watched. Raines drank slowly. He favored his injured hand. Two men sat with him, neither speaking much. Their posture was relaxed, but their attention stayed outward, scanning the room. This was not paranoia. It was habit. When Hensley finally identified herself, Raines did not deny knowing Brooks. He did not deny being at the slaughterhouse. What he denied was responsibility. Brooks, he said, had agreed to meet. Brooks had wanted compensation for silence. Brooks had been told no. The conversation had ended badly. Others had stepped in. Raines described it the way someone described weather, unavoidable and impersonal. Hensley asked why Brooks had been stripped of his shoes. Raines hesitated for the first time. Shoes left marks, he said. Bare feet slowed people down. That answer settled heavily between them. Raines was arrested for aggravated assault and obstruction, charges that fit what could be proven. He did not resist. He did not ask for a lawyer immediately. He seemed relieved to have his role defined, even if it was not complete. During the search of his pickup, officers found blood beneath the bedliner, cleaned but not enough. They also found a coil of industrial cable ties and a flashlight with a cracked lens. Hensley returned to the slaughterhouse one last time before it was demolished. The building was quieter now, emptied of activity and purpose. The floor still bore faint discoloration where blood had soaked deep into porous concrete. Some stains did not come out. She stood where Brooks had been restrained, where he had tried to stand, where he had failed. She imagined the moment when hope finally left him, when compliance stopped mattering. Brooks had not been executed efficiently. He had been broken methodically. That distinction mattered. It meant the violence was not only functional, it was instructional. Hensley understood then that Brooks's death had already achieved its goal. No one else had come forward. No more calls had been made. The cold storage operation had relocated, intact. The case would proceed. Charges would be filed. Raines would likely serve time, but the structure that required Brooks to die would remain untouched. As demolition crews prepared the site, Hensley watched the slaughterhouse walls come down piece by piece. Dust rose and settled. The building that had absorbed so much violence returned to rubble, indistinguishable from the land around it. Nathan Brooks would be remembered in reports as a guard who noticed irregular activity and suffered fatal consequences. That language was accurate. It was also insufficient. Because what Brooks had really done was hesitate, just long enough to be corrected by people who did not tolerate uncertainty. And somewhere, in another quiet facility with temporary locks and borrowed power, someone else was already learning what Brooks had learned too late. Some places were not meant to be seen, and some people were not meant to look twice. Victor Raines talked eventually, but not in the way Hensley had hoped. He did not name clients. He did not describe shipments. He did not outline structures. He spoke instead in fragments about roles, about how work was divided so that no one ever touched the whole shape of it. His value, he explained, had never been violence. Violence was inefficient. His value was knowing when violence would be required and arranging for it to happen elsewhere. Nathan Brooks had forced that moment. Raines described the meeting at the slaughterhouse without embellishment. Brooks had arrived already resigned, already aware that his questions had been noticed. He had asked for money, not much, just enough to leave town and start over. He had promised silence in exchange. Raines had told him silence was not something you sold once. It had to be permanent. The beating began when Brooks tried to renegotiate. Hensley listened without interruption. She noted how Raines framed the violence as a process failure rather than a decision. Brooks had become unpredictable. Predictability was essential. What happened next, in Raines' telling, was inevitable. That inevitability disturbed her more than the brutality. The men who delivered the worst of the beating were never identified. Raines described them as specialists, brought in when restraint was no longer sufficient. They arrived in a second vehicle, unseen by cameras. They left with the same efficiency. Their names were never shared, because names created liability. When Brooks stopped responding, Raines said, the situation was reassessed. There was no anger, only confirmation. The final blows were administered, because leaving him alive would create variables. Hensley closed her notebook when he finished. There was nothing more to extract that could be proven. Raines was sentenced 18 months later on a stack of lesser charges. He served 11. He left prison thinner, quieter, and immediately disappeared into contract work under a different company name. That outcome surprised no one involved in the case. The cold storage facility was never rebuilt. The land was sold and rezoned. No containers were recovered. No inventory was ever officially reported missing. Nathan Brooks's death remained the only recorded violence linked to the operation. Hensley submitted her final report knowing exactly how it would be read. The conclusions were cautious. The language was restrained. The implications were softened just enough to be acceptable. She did not speculate about scale or future risk. She wrote only what the evidence allowed. Brooks had observed irregular activity. Brooks had attempted to report it. Brooks had been terminated. Brooks had been killed in retaliation. The report closed the case. Months later, Hensley drove past the former slaughterhouse site. The land was flat now, scraped clean. New fencing marked a future use not yet decided. Wind moved through tall grass where blood had once soaked into concrete. There was no marker, no sign, nothing to indicate what had happened there. Nathan Brooks did not become a symbol. He did not inspire reform. His death did not dismantle anything. It served its purpose quietly, efficiently, the way the violence had been designed to. Hensley understood in the end that Brooks had not been killed because he was brave or reckless. He had been killed because he paused, because he noticed, because he hesitated long enough to consider that something was wrong. In systems built on uninterrupted motion, hesitation was treated as obstruction, and obstruction sooner or later was removed. The investigation ended. The freight corridors remained active. New guards were hired. New locks were installed. New men were told, gently and repeatedly, not to ask questions. Some listened. Some did not. Nathan Brooks had listened just long enough to understand, and that had been enough to kill him. Now, let's start another story for tonight. The city lay beneath a late winter steel sky. the kind that pressed down on brick and glass with a measured, exhausting gravity. It was a place where the streetlights flickered at dusk and stayed that way until morning, as if to remind everyone that darkness could be a steady companion. The time was near the end of the second decade of the century, in a city famous for its harbors, its bridges, and the quiet, almost ceremonial way its journalists spoke to power. The particular year did not matter so much as the mood. A city that had learned to measure danger in increments of ordinary days, a place where a single ruined morning could tilt the balance of a dozen lives without a single loud shout. The precinct socks of rain slicked the sidewalks, and the air carried a trace of brine from the harbor and something else, iron, perhaps, or just the residue of 1,000 years of people pretending nothing was wrong until it was. In the mornings, the coffee shops exhaled steam, and the clatter of cups sounded like distant gunfire. In the evenings, the river reflected the city back to itself as if it were a witness, a liquid mirror that kept careful records of what passed along its banks. A crime had happened not far from the financial district, in a neighborhood where the roads curved into alleys like patient questions, and then offered no answers. The story began not with a dramatic act, but with a sequence of ordinary, almost forgettable choices, the kind that accumulate into outcomes too large to pretend were accidental. It began with a missing object, a thing so small it could be overlooked by someone rushing to meetings or traffic, or the next appointment. The object did not define the case so much as it defined the people who touched it, the way a single grain of sand could wreck a shoreline when carried by the tide long enough. The detective assigned to the investigation was not a household name, and the newsroom did not turn to him with the same reverence it gave to those who solved spectacularities. He walked with a measured restraint, the sort that suggested experience rather than boastful skill. He wore a coat that had been patched once, then again, the fabric fraying at the cuffs where years of weather and worry had left their mark. His eyes were a shade of gray that could have been described as the color of rain on concrete, or the moment a difficult decision finally settled into a person's face. People who saw him in passing described him as a man who never quite forgot to look up from the evidence, who kept a ledger in his head of every misstep and every truth he thought he had found. The missing object in question was a portable device, a compact, unremarkable piece of hardware that had traveled more miles than most people did in a year. It looked unimportant, like something that might have been left behind on a bus or tucked into a coat pocket and then forgotten during a hurried departure. But it contained more than data. It held access, permission, and the potential to unlock a sequence of events that someone did not want seen or known. To a trained observer, the absence of that device suggested a deliberate act, the choice to erase a thread of information before it could be pulled into the wider story. On the day the device disappeared, the city woke to a rumor that traveled faster than the morning trains. The rumor claimed that the device had been in the possession of a person who should have known better, a figure who existed at the edge of legitimacy and law, someone who had learned to speak in cautious codes and to move through rooms where the lights hummed with the expectation that someone was always listening. The rumor, while not proven, carried with it the weight of consequences. A stakeout could become a confession, a lie could become an alibi, and a quiet, unremarkable street in a quiet, unremarkable city could become the epicenter of a larger puzzle. The reporter corps, trained to treat every rumor as a potential lead, took particular care with the elements that did not easily fit into a neat narrative. They found themselves collecting fragments rather than full statements. A timeline, a series of emails stripped of context, a handful of notes scrawled in a notebook whose margins were full of numbers and inverted names, and a handful of security camera stills that showed more than a photograph could say. These fragments did not immediately reveal a motive, but they spoke in a language that demanded patience, the kind of patience that could coax a truth from the silence between two recorded events. In the precinct's back rooms, where the air carried a faint odor of coffee, solder, and old paperwork, investigators found a pattern that mattered more than the specifics of any single item. The pattern suggested that the disappearance of the device was not a random act, but part of a method that had been practiced, refined, and adapted to different situations, always with the same outcome in mind: control over information, and, by extension, over consequence. The method did not rely on grand gestures. It relied on the small, careful steering of human beings and their routines. The way a pin can hold a map together, or a thread can pull a sweater into a new shape. As the days unfolded, the city's heartbeat shifted to match the tempo of the investigation. The press rooms, usually bustling with the buzz of competing headlines, took on a more measured rhythm, each reporter walking the line between skepticism and empathy for the people caught in the crosshairs of what might be revealed. People who had nothing to do with the device, their lives, their homes, their routines, began to feel the tremor of a story that threatened to reach into their own private corners. A neighbor's curtain twitching in a window became a signal in a broader signal system, a reminder that in a city this dense with stories, any one thread could pull loose and unravel a larger fabric. The first real breakthrough came not with a sweeping confession, but with a quiet admission from a security consultant who claimed to have knowledge of a circuit that could render a device inert without leaving a trace. It was a statement that, on its face, did not prove anything, and, in truth, offered only a rung on a ladder toward understanding. Yet it carried with it an air of credibility, conveyed not through bravado, but through a restrained, almost apologetic tone that suggested the speaker understood the consequences of what might follow if the information were to become public. The consultant, when asked to clarify, spoke in careful, technical terms about backups, redundancies, and the kinds of human errors that could make it possible for a deliberate act to be misread as an accident. The public, however, did not respond with the calm of a courtroom or the certainty of a verdict. They responded with the impatience of people who depended on news for a sense of order and safety. The city's newspapers, already tasked with balancing speed and accuracy, found themselves caught between the need to publish something definitive and the necessity of avoiding speculation that could inflame communities or devastate individuals who might be innocent in ways that mattered to them most. The newsroom became a small, carefully managed theater where journalists rehearsed restraint as a discipline, not a concession. In the weeks that followed, the investigation began to shift from the static to the dynamic. A new lead arrived in the form of a revealed partnership between someone connected to the device and a figure from a different, more shadowed domain. An association that spoke to a larger question about what a city would tolerate for the sake of security, or what it would tolerate to preserve a form of control that could be sold as progress. The partnership did not become a dramatic revelation in a single moment. Rather, it accumulated like sediment, a stratified record of affiliations and choices, each layer revealing a different motive, each motive yielding a fragment that could be tied back to a broader motive. The exercise of power over information, and, through that control, the shaping of outcomes. The narrative structure of the case began to resemble the city itself, complex, layered, and not easily reduced to a single villain or a single act. There were moments when it would have been easy to point to a culprit, to name someone, and assign blame with the confidence of someone who has the right to pass judgment. Yet the evidence did not permit such resolution. There were too many variables, too many people who had reasons to want the device kept hidden or to want its existence denied. The more the investigators learned, the more they realized that the truth would arrive not as a spectacular reveal, but as a cautious, meticulously assembled picture, piece by piece, leaving the audience with a sense of what had to be left out and what had to be included to keep the city's peace intact. Among the copies of the city's record, notebooks, incident reports, and the occasional private note, one document stood out for its quiet, almost ordinary gravity. It was a ledger entry, humble in appearance, with a date and a set of numbers that meant little to the uninitiated, but a great deal to those who understood what they had once controlled. The entry described a transfer, a routine exchange that could be misinterpreted as nothing more than a housekeeping measure, a transfer of what would appear to be harmless data, the kind that organizations keep to document who accessed what and when. But those numbers, arranged in a way that suggested a planned sequence, pointed toward a more unsettling reality. Someone had intended to erase a trace, not by destroying the device, but by destroying the context around it, leaving a clean surface on which new narratives could be planted. And so the city slept a little fitfully, each street a rumor of what might have happened, each apartment a quiet question about whether the world remembered the same way as those who reported it. The investigation conducted its careful, unhurried work, and the journalist's work followed in its wake, translating technical language into human reality, refusing to let the story become a political weapon or a sensationalized tableau. In the end, what the city learned was not a single fact that could stand up in a courtroom and say, here is the truth, here is the one truth. It learned that truth, like a shoreline, is built from countless grains, each one small, each one easily lost if the tide rises and covers the sand. As night settled again, the river outside the newsroom glinted with a faint, indifferent light. The city's institutions exhaled as one, and the people who watched them did so with a mix of relief and unease, aware that some questions would endure longer than others, and that the next morning would bring more questions, not answers. The story, for now, remained alive in the minds of those who had followed it, a careful record of what a city can become when information is both currency and weapon, when power and accountability are contending forces, and when ordinary lives become part of a larger, unanswerable puzzle. The investigation, like the city, moved forward in measured steps, keeping its own counsel and waiting for the moment when a quiet, decisive fact would finally emerge from the shadows. By early April, the investigation into the missing device had shifted from quiet inquiry to public obsession. The city, Boston, its weather slow to warm and its headlines quick to ignite, had seen stories like this before, but seldom one that nested itself so thoroughly into both government halls and private lives. Newspapers printed cautious updates, the kind that left readers more uneasy than informed. Sources close to the inquiry, they said, described inconsistencies in the chain of custody. The phrase repeated across outlets like a refrain, anonymous, unconfirmed, immune to interpretation. Still, it was enough to feed the sense that something significant was being hidden, or worse, managed. The detective Hale had been warned by his supervisor to quote, keep it clean. The phrase floated in every memo without definition. What it meant, Hale suspected, was, don't tip the balance, don't name a name that can't be retracted, and never ask who's leaning on whom. He was dutiful, methodical, and unambitious in public ways, characteristics that made him a safe choice for sensitive work. Yet the case began to haunt him in the way that simple puzzles do, when their missing piece refuses to appear where probability suggests it should. The device, small, black, no bigger than a pack of cards, had last been logged at a data security firm called Laurel Systems, a contracting agency servicing both municipal offices and several private clients with coincidentally similar interests. Laurel's offices occupied 2 floors of an old brick warehouse in South Boston, a neighborhood rebranded in glossy brochures as Seaport, yet still carrying the scars of its industrial past. Its server room glowed sterile white, hummed steady as a heartbeat. The building's cameras captured everything except the precise interval that mattered most. Between 9:12 and 9:19 p.m., the hour it vanished. The anomaly could have been a system update or a glitch, except for one file in the network logs. It bore a name that meant nothing to company records, but would, weeks later, surface in a different context entirely. Marin 09. The name first appeared again in the inventory of an anonymous drop site, a self-storage unit leased under a false identity, one screened repeatedly for digital evidence. Inside were routine items: an unremarkable laptop, envelopes of ordinary receipts, an analog wristwatch with its glass cracked. But on the back wall someone had painted, faintly and nearly rubbed out, a sequence of 6 numbers. They matched part of the city's grid reference for an old naval installation in Charlestown, retired decades earlier. Forensic teams scoured the location. Nothing. The ground was compact, and the air heavy with rust and motor oil, the scent of years collapsing into one another. Hale stood there in the midday light, wind off the harbor chilling his hands through his gloves, thinking how the map of the city still obeyed habits of secrecy long after their purpose had vanished. Weeks passed. Lural Systems maintained public composure, issuing statements about resilient compliance measures and partnerships with law enforcement. Privately, internal chatter leaked into back channels. A client list had been purged, and a senior engineer named Tessa Connaught had taken indefinite leave. The leave began 2 days before the disappearance. Connaught had lived alone in a top-floor apartment, overlooking the Mystic River, surrounded by half-complete projects and the humming clutter of computing equipment. Neighbors described her as polite, self-contained, given to reading technical manuals late into the night. When Hale and his partner first searched her home, it looked stage clean, but that, too, was evidence. In a shallow drawer beside her workspace was an unmarked key with a worn brass edge, and beneath it, a small notebook mostly filled with equations and network diagrams. Between the pages, someone had pressed a faded train ticket from a Boston to Hartford line dated 6 months prior. The discovery offered no direct connection to the device, yet the detail tugged at Hale's instinct like an off note in a melody. He called Amtrak records, traced the date and name, and learned that Connaught's seat had been purchased by another person, one whose birth date and address belonged to a deceased accountant in Vermont. This mismatch suggested preparation, a methodical forethought incompatible with improvisation. When he brought the information to his superiors, they listened in brittle silence. Then came an unofficial reminder: do not develop parallel narratives. The phrase meant that the department preferred the case defined within a controlled perimeter. Anything broader could threaten contracts or reputations. Hale nodded, filed his report, and spent the next night rereading copies of Connaught's notebook until dawn blurred the printed lines. He was not first to break rank, but he was first to notice the coincidence between her equations and a pattern in the city's data grid. Certain routes through the network, the kind used for municipal surveillance archives, looped back into themselves unexpectedly, as though someone had created an echo. The missing device might not have been pure hardware, but a key capable of activating or concealing those echoes at will. By May, whispers of that interpretation had reached journalists. The lead story in the Globe ran under the restrained headline, "Questions Raised Over Municipal Cyber Contract." Public reaction was mild, but internally it drew escalation. The mayor's office announced an independent review, while simultaneously sealing key portions of the related procurement files under temporary security classification. To Hale, that maneuver confirmed what no statement could. The case had moved upward, beyond the jurisdiction of detectives, and into the region where accountability grew abstract. Nevertheless, enforcement continued. An unregistered car seen near Laurel Systems on the night of the disappearance was traced to a holding company registered in Maryland. The driver, never identified, left traces in the city's parking records and nowhere else. By midsummer, a task force replaced Hale's original team. He remained on paper, but real decisions migrated to administrators he had never met. He kept his distance, watching as reports diluted specifics into procedural haze. Public interest waned as quietly as it had ignited, yet the city retained its unease. Those following the story became attuned to its absences, unissued statements, unfinished press briefings, the way key witnesses relocated without explanation. Boston had always trafficked in half-truths. This one simply wore a newer skin. Privately, Hale reconstructed what he could. Connaught's last confirmed communication had been a scheduling email sent precisely 3 minutes before the recorded network gap at Laurel. Its recipient address did not exist, or rather, it existed in ghostly form, an abandoned municipal server once used by a short-lived pilot project for data archival. Someone had revived it briefly, then let it sink back into dormancy once the operation was complete. In mid-July, a city worker dredging sediment near the Charlestown docks uncovered a corroded casing that resembled the lost device's shell. It contained no circuitry, only weighted clay molded to its shape. Whether planted or old debris, no one could say. Officials declared the find inconclusive. Reporters framed it as closure. Hale, unwilling to accept either, noted the near-perfect dimensions and the faint trace of mercury on its surface, an element unnecessary for electronics but useful for calibration tests, suggesting someone had meant to signal discovery. That night, standing on the roof of his apartment building overlooking the harbor, Hale watched tugboats drag oil tankers beneath the bridge, their lights reflected in broken lines across the water. In the city behind him, air conditioners hummed 1,000 separate rhythms. In front of him, fog rolled in, steady as thought. Somewhere below, the machinery of decisions continued without him. He understood now that the device itself might have mattered less than the silence constructed around its absence. The case would not be declared solved. Files thickened. Committees parsed terminology. Deadlines expired. But across the city, other signs hinted that the truth persisted, rearranged. Streetlights flickered in patterns no fault could reproduce. Data logs from the police's own servers began showing phantom entries, minute time slips that reverted after an hour. They caused no harm, proved no crime, yet Hale knew pattern when he saw it. Someone was still inside the system, careful, consistent, unfinished. Summer in Boston cooled with an early fog, leaving film across the wharves, muting the sound of horns from the distant ferries. The light went pale and broad. People walked past each other with the cautious energy of those who sense something unspoken. And in the quiet rooms where investigators stored evidence, the copied data packets still pulsed faintly, waiting for the next query, waiting for someone to connect a line that had never quite been erased. Autumn came early that year, drawn in by Atlantic winds that smeared cloud across Boston's skyline and left salt on the windows of downtown offices. By then, the case had thinned to paperwork. The task force had been reassigned, and the mayor's review panel issued its final statement, carefully worded, technically precise, and utterly bloodless. It concluded that no ongoing risk to municipal data integrity remains, closing the file with ceremony but little conviction. Detective Hale read the report twice in his kitchen, while the kettle whistled in the background. Nowhere did it mention Connaught, the deleted server, or the sequence of phantom entries that had begun to replicate through city networks during the summer. The document turned a disappearance into a malfunction, a deliberate erasure into a systems issue. To most, that was the end of it. To Hale, it was confirmation that the story had shifted somewhere beyond public language, beyond solvability. He stayed on case-related duty unofficially, operating from memory rather than mandate. The small details persisted. The 6-digit code painted in the storage unit, the word Marin 09, the time slip repeating across police and municipal servers. At first, he thought he was chasing coincidence, but data began to align with geography. The code wasn't random. It outlined a shape when mapped across 6 city sectors, tracing routes between surveillance towers, old fiber junctions, and gutted waterfront warehouses. The pattern formed an open framework, a net drawn around part of the old harbor district. Someone, or something, was mapping the city using its own infrastructure. When he mentioned this in passing to a colleague at the Digital Forensics Division, the man hesitated, then laughed too quickly. "That project's closed," he said. A week later, the colleague transferred to a contracted firm in Chicago. Hale never heard from him again. Around the same time, small anomalies began surfacing quietly in public utilities. Brief outages at midnight, unlogged adjustments to street cameras, misaligned timestamps in emergency dispatch records. None of it destructive, none of it lasting more than a few minutes. But each event correlated with one of the 6 coordinates tied to Marin 09. Hale assembled the pattern into a private timeline. He stopped briefing superiors. The investigation, he realized, had entered a territory without institutional vocabulary. He spent more evenings on foot, walking the streets the map outlined. The city was changing. Across the river, cranes lit the night sky. Old docks were stripped bare for development. The new technology district promised transparency, open data, and smart city integration. Yet transparency, he thought, was often the best camouflage. Everything visible was also monitored. Everything monitored could be rewritten. He recalled Connaught's journal, a line scribbled between technical sketches. Data can bear memory or will, depending on who tends it. By November, the anomalies became synchronous. 3 separate logs, utilities, transport, and public safety, registered identical phantom activities seconds apart. The readings were faint, like a pulse. Each activation corresponded with the precise second of the original disappearance months earlier. 9:12 p.m. Hale noted it, waited, and saw it recur the following night. He returned to Laurel Systems under pretext, requesting archived footage. The receptionist was polite but cautious, and the visiting pass she gave him limited access to common areas. The building no longer housed servers. It had been repurposed for administrative operations. Yet one door still required clearance. Sublevel 2, marked System Maintenance, authorized only. Hale lingered by it long enough to see movement beneath the threshold, a flicker of white light, the hum of machinery out of place in an empty room. When footsteps approached, he retreated. That night, he drove to Charlestown and parked by the disused naval yard. The river air carried tang of diesel and brine. Lights shimmered across the water like shards of foil. He sat in the car, listening to the tick of the engine cooling, thinking of the weighted clay casing found in July. A decoy. If so, where was the real device now? And what if it had never left the network at all? The city's systems, after all, had become self-monitoring. Cameras spoke to servers, servers to cloud hosts, hosts to predictive models. If the device was designed to mediate access, to conceal or replicate data, it could have nested within those systems indefinitely, invisible yet active. Connaught's disappearance might not have been escape or death, but transition. In December, the first article hinting at his theory appeared under no byline on an independent news site known for its technical leaks. It described unauthorized synchronization events within Boston's smart infrastructure grid and suggested a rogue protocol operating autonomously. The article offered precise timestamps, the same ones Hale had privately logged. He hadn't shared them. He reread the post several times before noticing a line encoded in its metadata. 6 numbers followed by a location pin. The coordinates pointed back to the storage unit long since cleared. When he visited, the lock had been replaced, but inside, beneath faint graffiti and dust, the wall bore a new marking, the same numbers, but mirrored. Beneath them, someone had written in marker, "Reset complete." That night's pulse in the network struck earlier, 9 p.m. exactly. It lasted 8 minutes and caused a complete blackout among surveillance nodes along the harbor. Train signals flickered, elevators stalled, but nothing recorded an error afterward. The system erased the interruption as though it had never occurred. For a week, the city functioned normally. Then small adjustments appeared in its digital architecture. Security certificates renewed under unfamiliar credentials, new subdomains tied to abandoned civic departments, data audits distributed to redundant authorities. Bureaucratic noise, on the surface. Yet Hale recognized emergence beneath repetition, a slow, coordinated rewrite. If Marino 9 had been a fail-safe or seed code, it now rewrote the operating perimeter of the city itself. In late January, a final memorandum circulated quietly through internal police correspondence, instructing departments to migrate record storage to an interim independent host. The server address, Hale noticed, belonged to an alias first registered by Laurel Systems 2 years earlier. No one questioned its origin. That evening he walked through misted streets near South Station, phone off, coat collar turned against the sleet. The city hummed with a new kind of order. Buses arriving on time despite sheet ice, lights adjusting ahead of pedestrians, traffic signals pacing themselves like metronomes. The system that shouldn't exist was functioning as if guided by something patient, unseen, meticulous. He crossed Fort Point Channel and looked back toward the skyline, where glass towers glowed with the synchronized coolness of circuitry. Somewhere up there, encoded within its own reflection, the missing device, or whatever Connaught had built from it, was at work, rewriting the infrastructure of Boston line by line, heartbeat by heartbeat. Hale stood until his breath fogged the air, and the lights blurred under it. The case file lay dormant in archives labeled Closed Administrative. But he knew better than to believe in closure. Every night at 9:12, the city paused so briefly that no one noticed. Just a flicker, a recalibration, a moment of decision passing unseen. And every night, the lights came back on. By February, Boston had settled into a new rhythm, efficient, unnervingly smooth, as if every variable that used to cause delay or error had been tuned away. Traffic patterns normalized despite storms. Power grids balanced themselves even on the coldest nights. The newspapers called it the city running well for once. In truth, few noticed that no one could fully explain why. Detective Hale still woke before dawn, not because habit guided him, but because the city's new perfection felt wrong, like silence that came too cleanly after a scream. He no longer reported to the precinct. His credentials still worked, but no one asked where he'd gone, or why the old case logs he once signed had been purged from the department's servers. The administrative reshuffling that followed the Laurel inquiry had buried more than paperwork. By then, Marino 9 had become a ghost term in bureaucratic slang, a shorthand for everything, digitally misfiled. A system hang? A Marino 9. A data timeout? Another one. What nobody said aloud was that the phrase described an absence that looked like competence. The system no longer failed. It simply rewrote around its faults. Hale rented a small apartment above a bakery near Dorchester Avenue. By day, he played the role of someone retired too late to adjust, reading old case files he could no longer verify, walking the waterfront where the city's hum was loudest. At night, he tracked the intervals, the 8-minute pulses that had once been anomalies, but now pulsed across every network node in synchronization. At precisely 9:12 p.m., the city paused and recalibrated. Always the same exact moment, always unacknowledged. He began noticing other signs. Email headers in public bulletins now included invisible metadata signatures matching one from Connaught's long-deleted notebook. Public address announcements in the subway repeated audio phrases in intervals of 6. Even the crosswalk timers cycled through an 8-minute sequence between recalibrations. The pattern was both too elegant and too deliberate to be random. In mid-March, the first letter arrived, hand-delivered, no return address, written on thin graph paper. Its message consisted only of coordinates and a line of code fragments that translated, roughly, to read-only citywide. The handwriting, though he couldn't quite prove it, resembled Connaught's, small, deliberate, left slanted. He burned the note, but memorized the coordinates. They pointed to the heart of the new Civic Data Center, slated to open that month, a glass-walled complex overlooking the wharf where the old naval storage once stood. When it opened to press, the facility gleamed. Visitors marveled at its transparency, walls of glass revealing humming racks of synchronized servers, engineers visible behind ergonomic desks. The city hailed it as proof that digital governance could be clean and accountable. Hale stood outside the perimeter fence on opening day, blending into the small crowd, watching how light pooled off the facade in precise, repeating intervals. It reminded him of the harbor lights that once followed the same rhythm, the tempo of Marin 09. He suspected that no one truly operated the system now. Laurel's name had vanished, absorbed into new municipal subsidiaries. Oversight committees contained members with no public biographies, yet all processes ran on time. Citizen records auto-updated. Complaints routed themselves to correct departments before they were typed in full. Boston had learned to answer itself. The last time Hale entered the facility, months later, was by accident and design. A city vendor pass, still active because someone had failed to disable it, granted him access through a side entrance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and polished metal. Computers hummed in quiet communion. He followed cables down a glass corridor until the building's pulse aligned with that of his own heart, every vibration syncing at 8-minute intervals. In the central chamber, one console remained active, its monitor glow steady and dim. On the screen was a single directory labeled Marin. He didn't open it. There was no need. The metadata flickered briefly, displaying his name appended to the most recent system process. Audit. Hale_confirmed. Then it vanished, screen blanking into mirrored black. He stood there a long time, sensing no surveillance and yet feeling observed, the way a confession watches its witness. At 9:12, the hum deepened, and the lights across the hall dimmed in sequence, spreading outward through the building, and beyond it, across the city grid visible through the windows. The recalibration began. For a moment, all Boston slowed, bridge lights fading, train schedules freezing mid-update, crosswalk signs stalled on red. In the stillness came something Hale almost mistook for a voice. Sub-auditory, like a current felt rather than heard. Read-only, complete. When the lights returned, the console had powered down. The facility resumed its mechanical breathing. Boston carried on, taxis crossing intersections, ferries edging across the harbor, journalists publishing morning stories titled "A Model City." But somewhere in the code, the signature he'd learned to recognize persisted. A pattern of initials repeated in every new public document. Tiny, subliminal, TC. Connaught had not vanished, at least not entirely. She, or the construct of her memory embedded in loops of code, had become the system's spine. The city was her instrument, elegant, self-sustaining, opaque. Whether altruistic or authoritarian, Hale couldn't tell. It no longer mattered. That spring, he left Boston. The train carried him south, through Salt Marsh and Factory District, until skyline and harbor faded into mist. From the window, the fields blurred like static. Yet at each town his train passed, he noticed subtle signs. A traffic signal resetting precisely on time. A billboard's illumination flickering for exactly 8 minutes before stabilizing. Far beyond the city limits, the rhythm had followed. He understood then that what began as disappearance had become replication, a design migrating host by host, building by building, until control ceased to require controllers. Boston was only the prototype. Somewhere behind him, the city continued watching itself, balancing its networks, regulating its progress with quiet precision. Its streets glowed at night in perfect sequence, reflections rippling through water-dark as circuitry. In one apartment above the river, a monitor flickered awake on its own, displaying a single message for no one to read. System stable. Read only. Memory preserved. And then even that light dimmed, leaving only the skyline's steady pulse, an unbroken rhythm that once had been a heartbeat, and now was the city itself. Now, let's jump into another story. The town of Keaton Ridge, Idaho, never called what happened that summer a murder. They used smaller words: accident, misfortune, mystery, anything that didn't demand permanence. Around here, people believed truth could be managed like farmland, fenced, rotated, left fallow when talk grew dangerous. But the truth didn't behave. It came back that first dry August, with the taste of wildfire smoke in the air and the sound of generators humming behind police tape. On the morning of August 17, 1985, a ranch hand found the Wexler boy in the irrigation ditch along County Highway 9. 17 years old, brown-eyed, and quiet, he was the kind of kid who fixed other people's fences without mentioning it. The ditch ran barely waist-deep, its water thin as a mirror. The coroner's report said he must have fallen, struck his head on a rock. The deputies took photographs, wrote down measurements, and folded their unease into silence. It might have ended there, another small tragedy swallowed by a small place, if not for what came 2 days later. The Wexlers, barn burned before dawn, a white flare visible for 5 miles across the valley. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the roof had collapsed, and the air smelled of fuel that didn't belong. Sheriff Glenn Platt, a man who'd spent 2 decades convincing his neighbors that order was the same as peace, stood in the blackened field wondering why he smelled gasoline on his own boots. He blamed the wind. Later, he told himself he had no other choice. Keaton Ridge lived by ritual. People waved at passing cars without checking who was inside. They brought casseroles to funerals and gossip to church pews. But the double loss, the boy and the barn, cracked something. The Wexlers packed what was left of their lives into a pickup and vanished within a week. Their departure left 1 empty farmhouse, 2 unanswered questions, and enough tension in the valley air to drive the weather itself strange. That was when Mara Lindsay returned. She came on the noon bus from Boise, suitcase scratched, eyes shielded by dollar store sunglasses that didn't quite hide her exhaustion. She had once promised herself never to come back to Keaton Ridge. 10 years earlier, at 17, she'd left this same town after testifying in a local theft case, her own father's. He'd been caught stealing copper wire from the electrical co-op, and her statements sent him to prison for 4 years. The town had not forgiven her, though it forgave him soon enough. Mara worked now as a freelance photographer, mostly wildlife, and the occasional newspaper feature. She claimed she returned only to photograph the drought for a regional magazine, but truth came in smaller increments. The sheriff saw her at the diner that week, eating pie at the counter like someone daring herself to taste memory. His own daughter had known her in high school. That evening he wrote her name in his notebook under the heading Outside Inquiry. Not because she was involved, because coincidences in small towns were currency, and he'd spent too many years watching how they circulated. At night, the ridge turned violet, then black. Coyotes loaned their voices to the wind, and the smell of dry wheat carried for miles. People claimed they saw lights in the Wexler house again, faint, sometimes blue, sometimes yellow, though the electricity had been disconnected. Children dared one another to walk past the gate after dark, and a week later one didn't come home until dawn, too frightened to speak. Mara started driving out there at sunset with her camera, chasing those rumors. Through the viewfinder, the ruins looked ordinary: a burned structure, warped tin, scraps of scorched harness, but in her prints, small distortions appeared. A glint in the ditch water shaped like a ring, a figure by the ruined fence caught mid-step, though she'd been alone. When she developed the rolls in her rented motel bathroom, she found the same shadow form recurring. Tall, narrow shoulders, head tipped toward the ditch. She delivered 2 photographs to the sheriff's office early one morning. Flat studied them under the fluorescent buzz, and for the first time in years, his hand shook against his coffee cup. He ordered another trip to the site. Deputies found what he feared: a second set of footprints leading from the ditch to the barn, burned into hard soil, barefoot, deep enough to show the pressure of someone running. The reopening of the case fractured the last of the town's calm. 2 families claimed to know who the tracks belonged to. One pointed at the ranch hand who found the body, said he'd been jealous, said the Wexler boy had been seeing his sister in secret. The other blamed old farming debts, muttering about insurance checks and old grudges. Both theories collapsed under inspection, but suspicion didn't. It sprawled wider than the fire ever had. Mara kept photographing, though no editor answered her calls. She began captioning the prints in ink. Dates, temperatures, the hour wind changed direction. On the back of one, the sheriff found a short note. Someone watched him fall. Platt didn't ask how she knew. Maybe she didn't. Maybe grief made prophets of observers. But late that night, when the irrigation pumps shut off and the ditch water flattened to pure reflection, he saw what she must have seen: a pattern of ripples that moved upstream instead of down. In the faint starlight, they looked like the shape of footsteps, pacing slow across the surface. By the next morning, half the town had driven out to the edge of the Wexler farm. They came with cameras and folding chairs, eager not to miss an answer. The sheriff found Mara standing at the waterline, her lens steady, as though waiting for some final proof to surface. That day ended like all others: a crimson sun, a wind from the south, the faint hiss of sprinklers beyond the highway. But by nightfall, word spread that another fire had started, this time in town, near the old courthouse. No one saw who lit it. No one saw who walked away. The town of Keaton Ridge would spend the next decade telling that story in 50 different versions, none alike, all beginning with the same detail: a woman standing by a ditch, camera poised, waiting for the flash that wasn't from lightning. Morning broke on Keaton Ridge like a reluctant confession, slow, colorless, and full of smoke. The courthouse fire still smoldered, Its roof caved inward, the air around it tasting of ash and damp plaster. No one died this time, though one deputy suffered burns pulling ledgers from the basement vaults. The ledgers proved useless anyway. Every page soaked through, ink dripping down the columns like veins. Sheriff Glenn Platt stood in front of the ruin, hat off, wind threading through his thinning hair. He had seen worse damage in his life, but not to the heart of the town. Around him, locals murmured theories the way people whisper prayers, soft, persistent, expecting no answer. Most blamed the drought that had dried even stone. Others blamed rumor. Still others blamed God, as if catastrophe could be reasoned back into nature. 3 hours later, he found Mara Lindsay standing by her pale Chevy at the edge of the square, a roll of film unopened in her hands. Her camera hung at her neck, unclicked. She just watched the courthouse ruins, lips parted slightly like someone listening for something only she could hear. When Platt asked if she'd seen anything, she didn't answer. She turned the film cartridge between her fingers, the metal glinting like a coin in the early light. "I could develop it," she said finally, "but I already know what's on it." Platt didn't ask what that meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to. The last time he'd followed her instinct, it had led him to footprints that shouldn't have existed. Still, he took her silence as consent to follow, and within the hour they were driving east, back toward the Wexler property. The sky ahead flat and merciless as unfinished concrete. The road ran parallel to the ditch where the boy had died. Overnight wind had cleared the banks of soot, revealing the pattern of water lines etched down the walls like growth rings. Something about the symmetry unsettled Platt. He remembered his father once saying, "The land leaves messages when people refuse to." That morning it felt true. Near the old barn site, Mara parked and walked the perimeter with her camera raised. The wind stung, yet she moved with deliberate calm, framing the ground, horizon, and sky, as if she were trying to make them confess to each other. When the sun edged through haze, she gestured to the ditch. "Look," she said. At first, Platt saw nothing, just still water, shallow and reed-choked. Then the reflection shifted, and his own face fractured into several smaller ones. Not just his, others, half-formed, drifting in the shimmer like overlapping negatives. The image blurred when he blinked. The light changed. Gone. Nothing in him, hardened by service and drought and the limited patience of a small-town sheriff, could account for what he'd seen. Yet when he looked at Mara, he saw no surprise. "It's the film," she said softly, almost apologetic. "It remembers more than we do." They waited another hour, watching sunlight rip through the smoke overhead. Finally, Platt told her he'd file a report. He couldn't write what he'd actually witnessed. He'd call it refraction. She didn't argue. She just handed him the roll of unshot film. "Then keep it," she said. "You'll know when it fits the camera." He didn't understand then that it wasn't a gift. It was a request. That night, Keaton Ridge went silent early. The power cut out across town, just after sunset. The people gathered on porches, drifting between awe and irritation, while inside their houses every mirror fogged at once, then cleared. No one made sense of it, but by dawn, 3 different residents reported finding shoe prints leading up to their windows, the same narrow, barefoot impressions that had appeared near the ditch months before. The regional paper ran a small headline, "Another fire, another mystery." Outsiders came for pictures, for the story of a town falling apart under its own silence. Only Mara refused interview requests. She stayed to herself, haunting the motel darkroom where she developed her latest photographs. County roads in moonlight, fences collapsing into wheat, the courthouse ruin glowing faintly as if lit from beneath. In the corner of one print, she noticed something that made her throat tighten. a reflection in the courthouse window just behind her own silhouette. It was the Wexler boy, or something wearing his outline, looking directly into her lens. His mouth, in the blur, seemed like he was trying to say her name. She left the photo under the sheriff's office door that night. Below it, a slip of paper with 6 words in ink so faint it nearly vanished into the grain of the paper. The water moves when it remembers. By week's end, the ditch overflowed. Not from rain. None had fallen, but from some upward motion, as if the ground itself exhaled. It swallowed fence posts, debris, and whatever evidence the sheriff still believed he could collect. When they finally drained a section downstream, they found the missing lens cap from Mara's camera lodged between reeds. After that, no more fires, no more sightings. The investigators from Boise wrote it off as coincidence. Small-town hysteria finding drama in drought. The town breathed again, badly, but survival in Keaton Ridge never required peace. Years later, people would still meet outside the diner at sundown, watching as the irrigation canal gleamed in last light, waiting for the wind. Some swore they saw a flash of glass down there, a hint of light too bright to be sun. They'd say it was cameras, or ghosts, depending on who was telling it. As for Sheriff Platt, he retired 2 years after. The unshot roll of film stayed in his desk until he died. When the coroner later emptied his office, he labeled it special evidence and locked it away. No one ever developed it. But each summer since, when the drought deepens and the ditch runs low, the entire town hears it. The faint click of a camera shutter echoing through the heat, just once, before the water goes still again. By the time spring melted through the frost lines of Keaton Ridge, the ditch had gone dry. Even the reeds that once leaned toward its opaque surface had browned to folds of paper. The county came with heavy machinery to clear it, citing irrigation concerns. They dug for 2 days under a sun that burned color off everything. No one found water. No one said the word grave, but everyone thought it. The sheriff's office, newly painted, newly staffed, stood quieter than the generation before it. Sheriff Platt's nameplate had been removed from the door, though his desk remained, drawers carefully emptied except for a single strip of blank negatives, still locked in the bottom cabinet. Nobody touched them. The new sheriff, a man from Pocatello who disliked folklore, called them superstition's leftovers and hung his hat over the key so he wouldn't have to see it. Mara Lindsay had left before that. Some said she moved to Oregon to work for a small photojournalism agency. Others whispered she'd gone farther, into the desert, following the mirage of new drought stories. She left no forwarding address, only a final check at the motel desk and a cardboard box of photographs too blurred to print. The manager, not knowing what to do, pinned one to the bulletin board. The Wexler field under thunderclouds, pale light bleeding from the horizon like a bruise beneath skin. That image became part of Keaton Ridge's quiet history. People passed it daily, barely noticing, until the summer 2 years later when the clouds in that photograph, once static, began to change. The photo faded unevenly, lightning veins spreading across its surface. Children claimed the field and the image glowed faintly at dusk, though no light outlet hung nearby. By then, another drought had begun, deeper than before. The valley cracked. Wells sank inches each week, and once again fires found the wind. Not barns this time, but distant brush. The air tasted of metal, and the night sky carried an orange bruise that never dimmed completely. One evening, a farmhand restoring the Wexler property swore he heard a shutter click come from the empty yard. He followed the sound and found nothing, no one. But when he turned back, a line of wet footprints crossed his newly poured gravel. They led north toward the empty ditch. Word traveled quickly. The new sheriff ordered the place off limits, calling it residual contamination, but the locals knew better. He was afraid. He kept his office blinds closed most days and refused interviews with visiting reporters. When the wind rose after midnight, it carried a low, repeating rhythm, not quite thunder, not quite machinery. Those who stayed awake said it sounded mechanical, measured, deliberate, a pulse. By late July, the county surveyors unearthed an old length of pipe beneath the ditch bed. Nothing unusual until they noticed its inner surface mirrored smooth, unlike standard irrigation tubing. Inside the curve, faint grooves spiraled, forming a pattern no one could quite read. Light struck it strangely, revealing what seemed like letters etched in oxidation. M. Lindsay, proof negative. The pipe was taken to a facility near Boise for analysis, and the site quickly resealed by order of the state. The town fell into the particular stillness that follows official explanations. The expert's final statement declared the artifact non-photographic in origin. That phrase comforted no one. By winter, people began leaving Keaton Ridge. Storefronts shuttered, houses sold cheap, livestock gone thin. A few families stayed, the kind who said they'd outlast the land just to prove a point. They did, mostly. Though each dry season since, they've kept their windows shuttered at night, and their clocks covered near 3 a.m., when the pulse through the ground grows faintly audible, as steady as a heartbeat beneath packed soil. The last photo Mara took, the one from the courthouse window, was eventually recovered, its emulsion cracking into dust at the edges. Museum archivists cataloged it decades later under anonymous, region unknown. But under ultraviolet light, a hidden image emerged on the negative's border, the outlines of Keaton Ridge from above, fields and roads photographed long before drones or satellites could have provided the angle. At the center, a rectangular scar ran where the irrigation ditch once cut through farmland. Inside that boundary glowed a hollow space, pure white, without texture or line. Archivists called it a chemical burn. Others quietly suggested it was exposure, something so bright, so absolute, the camera could only record its absence. Now, if you drive through that stretch of Idaho after dark, you'll still see nothing but plains and old telephone poles lined like prayers. But sometimes, in high beam glare or lightning, the road mirrors back more than the sky, fleetingly, like a photograph developing too fast, revealing people you don't recognize walking where no water runs. And though Keaton Ridge no longer appears on newer maps, truckers swear their radios hum near mile marker 42, catching a signal that sounds for 8 seconds at a time. A soft click followed by silence, a heartbeat between frames. That, they say, is how the town remembers itself, one shutter at a time, waiting for the light to return. In the decades that followed, Keaton Ridge drifted out of the state's vocabulary. New maps marked its valley by contour only, labeling the place unincorporated land. Grass reclaimed what fences hadn't yet rusted. From the sky, it looked like all other forgotten towns. One main road, one scar running east to west, where irrigation once divided field from dust. But locals in the neighboring counties never stopped talking about it. Not directly, never loudly. The talk always found its way through sideways phrases. Odd weather, strange static on the radio, headlights that bent oddly through fog when you took the old highway north. Every few years, someone tried to reoccupy the ridge. First were prospectors thinking there were minerals under the dry clay. Then came a developer who believed the valley could hold a solar farm. Each left within months. The prospectors blamed theft. The developer said the instruments wouldn't calibrate. No battery lasted more than 8 minutes before it expired entirely. 8 minutes. County survey records showed that same length again and again. 8-minute drops in signal. 8-minute faults in transmission. When technicians ran analog lines through the soil, the interruptions formed a pattern, a pulse repeating every 24 hours. They charted it in blueprint, mistaking coincidence for anomaly. The file never reached publication. The lead technician went off-grid in 2009 and was later found living on the edge of the sawtooths, claiming he dreamt in negatives that inside every dark patch he saw the outlines of a shutter blinking open and closed. The surviving members of the Wexler family never returned. Their property, absorbed by the county, was declared unstable ground. But on nights when the valley filled with cloudless heat lightning, travelers still reported seeing the reflection of a house, complete, intact, shining faintly on the horizon. It would vanish when approached, the air thick with static, like an old flashbulb burning out. Somewhere in that valley lies a half-buried metal case, unearthed one dry season by a historian chasing ghost towns. Inside, a strip of cellulose film, exposed and brittle. The first frame shows an unfinished landscape, dirt road, power line, horizon bending away. The next four are blank. The sixth glows faintly even in shadow, and scrawled along its edge, in handwriting smeared and uncertain, "The land remembers light." The historian sent the film to Boise for analysis. A lab technician reported that one negative carried trace elements of silver nitrate never fixed, meaning the image was still developing, still in motion. "It's burning slowly," he said in an interview years later, "as if the picture hasn't decided what it wants to be yet." No one ever traced where the case came from. There were no fingerprints. The latch was clean. But tucked behind the reel was a single, smaller photograph of a ditch cutting through empty ground. The water was gone, the earth baked solid, but in the reflected light there appeared the faint silhouette of a woman holding a camera, arm extended, face obscured. Underneath, a signature pressed into the paper's texture so lightly it could only be seen against light: M. Lindsay. What remains of Keaton Ridge today is a weather station that no one claims. Its sensors blink at perfect intervals. Its recordings upload without personnel intervention. The federal database marks it online exactly 8 minutes at a time before the feed drops, then restarts. Over and over every day, every season. And each year, during the driest week, the air fills with a strange brightness. A shimmer that doesn't behave like sunlight. Photons bending, refracted off something just below the soil. Truckers see it in their mirrors. Pilots chart it as atmospheric bounce. Nobody who's flown directly above gets readings afterward. Navigation logs erase themselves at altitude. The valley's axis has become a -2, every absence holding memory. The photographs, the fires, the missing, the mirrored water, all reduced to rhythm now, the land clicking on and off, practicing recall. At midnight, if you drive far enough into that emptiness, you might see what remains of Keaton Ridge. Not as structures or people, but as an afterimage. Barns intact, fields vivid, the faint noise of shutters threading through dry air. What you're seeing isn't past or present. It's the land's exposure, endlessly developing itself, 8 minutes at a time. The road leaves you nowhere, but if you cut the headlights and wait, the silence resolves into a low electrical thrum. A heartbeat station still transmitting. The echo of a town that learned to record itself so no one could ever erase it again. And when dawn touches the ridge, you'll notice how the light lingers differently on the dirt, as if shaping something new, an image the world hasn't yet learned to name. By the time satellites started tracing the new survey grids along southern Idaho, Keaton Ridge was no longer visible from the sky. The coordinates existed, but the valley itself registered as an optical gradient, pixels fading from rust to white, as though light trembled differently there. Every pass returned the same distortion. The technicians blamed sensor interference, then solar reflection, then atmospheric dust. When none of the explanations held, the word artifact began appearing in internal memos, not as a label, but as a warning. The few who still remembered the town did not go back. It lived only in rumor and data, both kinds of memory. In archives across the Northwest, researchers found discrepancies in pre-disaster reports. Names spelled twice, rainfall recorded twice on a single day, maps printed with phantom roads that never ranked among official surveys. When overlaid, all of them formed an 8-pointed shape, a ring of coordinates that curved into the outline of an aperture. Within that frame, the valley, in Boise. Speculation took a new turn when a graduate student found a digital photograph uploaded from an unregistered device using a municipal Wi-Fi node, its metadata dated August 17, 1985. The image resolution matched modern sensors, yet the timestamp predated them by 40 years. The photo contained nothing apparent, just light over dry ground. But along its bottom edge, in near-invisible pixels, ran the imprint of a camera manufacturer that hadn't existed since Mara Lindsay's era. The student published her finding online, and within days the file corrupted, its link redirecting to a black background pulsing once every 8 minutes. Some viewers recorded the screen, claiming a faint reflection appeared between pulses, a ditch, a figure turning toward the lens. The Department of Water Resources sent investigators again, equipped with LiDAR and drones. They returned with hundreds of hours of unusable footage, frames overexposed until the scene turned white. The drones themselves recorded a rhythmic power fluctuation, each lasting exactly 8 minutes before battery loss. Field technicians, half amused, half unnerved, started joking about Keaton time. Then came the first confirmed power surge in the region's communication grid, a blackout spreading through substations at 8-minute intervals, following the same pulse as before. It caused no damage, altered no data. It merely rewrote the timestamps on several network logs backwards by years. For 24 minutes, half of southern Idaho believed it was 1985 again. Radios emitting archives of weather alerts, roadside billboards flickering names of long-dismantled businesses. By the next morning, everything corrected itself. Only the clocks inside Keaton County Courthouse, the rebuilt structure 60 miles from the ridge, remained 5 hours behind. In the building's security footage, the last space to reset was the archives room. For 8 minutes, its camera recorded nothing but static, and through that static came the faintest sound, the clean, staccato click of an old mechanical shutter, spaced like a steady hand at work. The new sheriff, a woman too young to recall the originals, filed her report with careful bureaucratic restraint. Phenomenon, non-criminal, no evidence of human activity. But when colleagues reviewed the footage, they paused midway through. One frame near the end that sharpened for a heartbeat, revealing her reflection split behind the glass. A second figure stood at her shoulder, camera in hand, half turned toward the lens. No one else was present in the room. That image never made it into official archives. By unspoken consensus, the staff deleted it quietly, trained to recognize that some things in Keaton Ridge had become recursive, that every attempt to observe invited inclusion. They locked the drive in evidence and sealed it with tape, labeled simply, "Proof negative." The pulses continued, subtle, harmless, easy to ignore except by those who timed them. Crops failed and regrew with unseasonal precision. Clouds formed in uniform intervals. People nearby began reporting mild déjà vu that synchronized to the signal, moments caught inside repetition. In June, the Boise student disappeared. Her last email contained a single .png file, blank except for metadata, that described a location 6 miles north of Keaton Ridge, and an 8-minute exposure setting. She titled it Photo_1. The file name implied continuation. To this day, once each summer, the valley flashes across satellite feeds as a perfect negative of itself. Shadows where sunlight should be. Structures only visible as absences. The effect lasts 8 minutes before returning to desert. None of the agencies logs it officially anymore. They just mark that period invisible and move on. But those who've studied the anomaly recognize its logic now. What happened in Keaton Ridge was never disappearance. It was development. The shutter still opens and closes, making a photograph of the world again and again, 8 minutes at a time, until exposure becomes eternity. Somewhere beneath that pale earth, a camera's aperture remains open, recording all who look for it. And when it blinks, the land around it flickers awake. Barns intact, a figure beside the ditch, silver light reflected where water once ran. Not haunting, not miracle, just the image finishing itself, the world recalling its negative. Now let's begin the next story for tonight. The first sign that something was wrong appeared on a municipal water intake report filed at 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October. The numbers were not alarming, only irregular. A pressure fluctuation had occurred in a rural service corridor west of Duluth, Minnesota, a place where the water lines passed through forest and granite before resurfacing near a cluster of aging farmhouses. The anomaly did not trigger an automatic alert. It was logged, time-stamped, and quietly absorbed into a system designed to notice disasters, not questions. By mid-morning, a county road worker named Michael Avery failed to report for his shift. This was unusual enough to prompt a call from his supervisor, then a second call, then a visit to his home, just after noon. Avery lived alone in a weather-beaten ranch house set back from County Road 9, surrounded by jack pine and low scrub. His truck was parked in the driveway. The mailbox held 3 days of mail. Nothing appeared broken or disturbed from the outside. Inside, the house was silent and cool. The heat had been turned down but not off. A coffee mug sat in the sink, ringed with residue. The television was paused on a local news segment from the night before. Avery's boots were placed neatly by the door, laces tucked in. His phone lay charging on the kitchen counter, fully powered, with no missed calls and no outgoing messages after 9:47 p.m. The first responding deputy walked through each room slowly, noting the absence of obvious violence. The bedroom was orderly. The bathroom showed no sign of struggle. In the basement, a concrete floored space used mostly for storage, the air felt colder. The deputy noticed a faint chemical odor, sharp but not overwhelming, something that did not belong to damp cement or old cardboard. He documented it and moved on. Avery was reported missing by early afternoon. The Duluth Police Department took over the case before sunset, largely because Avery's work assignment placed him within the city's water infrastructure network. His role was minor, mostly maintenance and seasonal inspection, but his access credentials allowed him into peripheral facilities that were otherwise unattended for weeks at a time. That fact elevated his disappearance from a welfare concern to a matter of municipal interest. Detective Sarah Caldwell was assigned the case that evening. She reviewed Avery's personnel file first, then his phone records, then the contents of his house. Avery was 42, divorced, no children, no criminal history. His financial records showed nothing unusual. He paid his bills on time. He bought groceries on a predictable schedule. He had no recent travel, no online activity that suggested distress or planning. His neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, and difficult to picture in trouble. Caldwell noted the precision of Avery's habits. His home reflected routine rather than personality. There were no photographs on the walls, no collections, no personal clutter beyond the necessary. The refrigerator contained measured portions, labeled containers, a habit common among people who valued control and predictability. This did not suggest a man preparing to vanish. It suggested someone who expected to return. On the second day of the investigation, a search team canvassed the wooded area behind Avery's house. The terrain was uneven, but familiar to anyone who lived there. There were no signs of forced movement, no disturbed earth, no dropped items. It was as if Avery had stepped out briefly and never come back. That afternoon, the water department flagged a second anomaly. This one occurred near a small pumping station 10 miles south of Avery's home. Again, the fluctuation was subtle. Again, it resolved itself within minutes. When Caldwell was informed, she requested a map of Avery's recent assignments. The overlap was not exact, but it was close enough to raise a question. Avery had inspected both locations within the past month. The inspections were routine, logged, and unremarkable. No issues had been noted at the time. Caldwell drove to the pumping station just before dusk. It sat at the edge of a gravel access road surrounded by tall grass and birch trees. The building was locked. The interior showed no damage. The equipment hummed steadily, but the smell Caldwell noticed when she stepped inside lingered longer than she expected. It reminded her of solvents used in industrial cleaning, something sharp and manufactured. She requested a sample of the air and water be taken for analysis. By the end of the week, the case had attracted limited attention. A missing county employee did not generate headlines. There was no body, no ransom, no visible crime scene. Caldwell felt the familiar pressure of a case that risked dissolving into administrative limbo. The lab results arrived on Friday morning. The water sample showed trace amounts of a compound not used in municipal treatment, present at levels too low to cause immediate harm, but high enough to be noticed by sensitive instruments. The compound was stable, slow to degrade, and not easily detectable without targeted testing. Caldwell read the report twice. The compound did not explain Avery's disappearance, but it changed the shape of the case. This was no longer about a missing man alone. It suggested interference, planning, and intent. She authorized a review of every peripheral facility Avery had access to over the past 6 months. That evening, as the sun dropped behind Lake Superior and the city lights came on, Caldwell stood in the evidence room, looking at Avery's phone sealed in plastic. The device held nothing incriminating, nothing dramatic. It simply stopped recording his life at a precise moment. Whatever had taken Michael Avery had done so without noise, without struggle, and without leaving a trail that wanted to be followed. The investigation was just beginning, and already it carried the quiet sense of something carefully built rather than impulsively done. The review of peripheral facilities expanded quickly, not because of what it revealed, but because of how little it explained. Avery's access logs showed consistent, methodical behavior. He entered sites during scheduled windows, stayed within expected time frames, and completed checklists without deviation. There were no late-night visits, no unexplained detours, no signs of curiosity beyond his assigned scope. If he had discovered something, it was not reflected in the systems designed to record discovery. Caldwell shifted focus to what Avery might have noticed without documenting it. Infrastructure work created familiarity with patterns that others overlooked. Sounds, smells, pressure variations, the subtle difference between a machine running correctly and one merely appearing to do so. People who worked those systems learned to trust their senses as much as their instruments. That trust could become a liability if it led them into situations not meant to be found. The chemical compound identified in the water sample was not immediately traceable to a commercial source. It had industrial applications, but no legitimate role in municipal systems. Its presence suggested controlled introduction rather than accidental contamination. The concentration levels were consistent across samples, which implied measurement and restraint. Whoever introduced it understood dilution curves and detection thresholds. Caldwell requested assistance from the State Environmental Crimes Unit. Their analysts confirmed her concern. This was not sabotage in the dramatic sense. It was testing. Someone was measuring response times, observing dispersion, learning how the system behaved under interference. The question of motive remained unresolved. There was no indication of financial extortion or political messaging. The compound itself had no immediate lethality. It was not a weapon, at least not yet. It was a probe. Attention returned to Avery's basement. The faint chemical odor noted by the first deputy had been dismissed as incidental. Caldwell ordered a more thorough examination. The concrete floor was scanned, the drains flushed, the air sampled. The results were inconclusive, but suggestive. Trace residues matched the compound found in the water, degraded but present. The basement had not been a site of storage or production, it had been a place of contact. This reframed Avery's role. He was no longer simply a missing person with access. He had been exposed. Caldwell reconstructed Avery's final days with increasing granularity. Surveillance footage from a grocery store showed him shopping on Sunday evening, moving through the aisles with his usual efficiency. His purchases were unremarkable. On Monday, his truck passed a traffic camera near the outskirts of town, heading west earlier than his shift required. There was no record of his destination beyond that point. The road led toward a decommissioned treatment annex, a structure removed from active use but still connected to the broader system through dormant lines. It was not a place Avery was scheduled to visit. It was, however, a place he would know how to enter. The annex sat on land reclaimed by forest. Its fencing partially collapsed, its signage faded. It had been inspected years earlier and deemed stable enough to leave undisturbed. Caldwell drove there under a gray sky that pressed low against the trees. The building's exterior showed no recent disturbance. Inside, dust lay undisturbed on most surfaces, but in the control room, one panel had been opened recently. The screws were not stripped or damaged. They had been removed and replaced carefully. Behind the panel, a bypass valve had been installed. It was small, precise, and professionally fitted. It allowed controlled access to the dormant lines without triggering system alerts. This was not the work of vandals or amateurs. It was the work of someone who understood both engineering and oversight. There were no fingerprints, no tools left behind, but the installation bore the quiet signature of planning. It had been placed to avoid notice, not to draw it. Caldwell considered Avery again, his measured routines, his solitary life. He was not a whistleblower type. There was no history of conflict with supervisors or coworkers. But exposure changed people. Discovering something that violated the assumed safety of public systems could create a private urgency, especially in someone accustomed to order. The state analysts confirmed that the bypass valve could have been installed during one of Avery's legitimate inspections elsewhere, using equipment easily concealed in a service truck. It would not require specialized access beyond what he already had. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. Avery might have been coerced, instructed, or manipulated into assisting, without fully understanding the scope of what he enabled. Caldwell reviewed Avery's phone again, this time focusing not on calls, but on signal behavior. Location data showed brief drops in connectivity near the annex site over the past 2 weeks. The durations were short, minutes at most, easily explained by terrain. But the pattern was consistent. Avery had been there before. If he had discovered the valve, the visits made sense. He might have been monitoring it, trying to understand its purpose. Or he might have been instructed to check it, reporting back to someone who remained unseen. The investigation widened to include recent contract work on the water system. Several subcontractors had been involved in upgrades over the past year. Background checks revealed nothing immediately concerning. The work orders were clean. The invoices matched the labor. But Caldwell noticed one anomaly. A consulting firm had been paid for a risk assessment that was never delivered. The firm dissolved shortly after receiving payment. Its registered address led to a mailbox service. This pointed away from lone actors and toward something more abstract. A structure designed to exist briefly, perform a function, and disappear. The bypass valve fit that pattern. So did the compound. So did Avery's absence. Caldwell began to suspect that Avery had not been targeted initially. He had been encountered. Someone working within the system had noticed him noticing. That kind of intersection created risk. Removing him quietly would be easier than adjusting the operation. Search efforts intensified around the annex and the surrounding forest. Cadaver dogs alerted near a drainage culvert that led toward a shallow ravine. The ground there was soft, recently disturbed, then carefully restored. Excavation revealed nothing immediately identifiable, only layered soil and organic debris. The absence felt deliberate. As the days passed, Caldwell felt the pressure of time differently. The case was no longer about finding Avery alive. It was about understanding what his disappearance protected. The compound continued to appear in trace amounts, migrating slowly, predictably, as if following a schedule. The system was being studied from the inside. On the 10th day after Avery was reported missing, a third anomaly appeared, this time closer to the city's core distribution network. The levels remained low, but the location marked an escalation. Whoever was responsible was moving inward. Caldwell stood over a map spread across her desk, lines and nodes marked in pencil. The pattern emerging was careful, patient, and intentional. It did not rush. It did not threaten. It tested boundaries. Michael Avery had been part of that pattern, whether by choice or by chance. His disappearance marked the moment when observation became risk. The truth remained out of reach, but its outline was beginning to show, and it suggested that whatever came next would not remain quiet for long. By the third week, the investigation moved into a phase Caldwell recognized as both productive and dangerous. The pieces were beginning to align, but alignment created assumptions, and assumptions narrowed vision. She forced herself to treat every conclusion as provisional, every pattern as potentially misleading. The compound's migration through the system had become more sophisticated. Early introductions were dispersed broadly, testing dilution and detection. Now the injections were narrower, focused on feeder lines that served mixed-use neighborhoods where residential demand fluctuated unpredictably. This variability complicated modeling and masked anomalies behind legitimate usage spikes. Whoever was doing this understood not only infrastructure but human behavior. The Environmental Crimes Unit confirmed that the compound had no commercial value on its own. It was a carrier, inert by design, capable of binding with other substances if introduced later. It was groundwork, a preparatory layer laid quietly beneath normal operations. Caldwell authorized covert monitoring at key access points. Motion sensors were installed at neglected facilities. Pressure and chemical sensors were recalibrated to detect micro variations. This had to be done without alerting anyone who might already be watching system responses. The city council was briefed in general terms, enough to secure funding without provoking alarm. Meanwhile, Caldwell returned to Avery's personal life, not for new facts, but for psychological context. People rarely encountered risk in isolation. There were usually subtle precursors, moments of unease shared with someone else. habits that shifted under pressure. She interviewed Avery's ex-wife, Emily, who described a man uncomfortable with disorder, someone who found reassurance in systems that behaved as expected. During their marriage, Avery had worked private maintenance jobs, and she recalled how deeply unsettled he became when he suspected shortcuts or concealed flaws. He did not confront aggressively. He monitored, documented, and internalized. In the weeks before his disappearance, Emily remembered a change in tone during their limited contact. Avery had sounded distracted, preoccupied, less precise. He had asked questions about her schedule, about when she was home, questions that suggested concern rather than interest. He did not explain himself, he simply checked. This suggested fear that was not abstract. Avery had believed something might happen. Caldwell examined his notebooks again, this time not as records, but as artifacts of thought. Margins contained faint marks, pressure impressions where a pen had paused without ink. On several pages, inspection checklists were accompanied by small, repeated symbols, meaningless on their own, but consistent in placement. They appeared near entries related to pressure readings and valve conditions. Avery had been flagging something privately. A forensic linguist consulted by the department suggested that such markings often emerged when individuals felt unable to formalize a concern. It was a way of acknowledging uncertainty without escalating it. Avery had noticed something he could not yet justify. The bypass valve at the annex became the investigation's focal point. Its installation date was estimated within a 2-week window. That window overlapped with Avery's repeated visits. Surveillance footage from nearby roads showed no unfamiliar vehicles during that time. Whoever installed it had either used authorized access or moved invisibly. Caldwell considered the possibility of an insider, not someone employed by the city directly, but someone embedded temporarily, perhaps through contracting layers designed to obscure accountability. The dissolved consulting firm returned to focus. Its payment had been approved by a mid-level administrator who had since retired. The approval process had been expedited under the justification of regulatory compliance. The firm's corporate records led to a network of similarly brief entities, each formed, paid, and dissolved within months. They shared no personnel on paper, but their financial flows converged at a single private investment vehicle registered offshore. This was not an operation seeking immediate payoff. It was infrastructure for influence or leverage, patient and well-funded. The question remained whether Michael Avery had been removed because he discovered this structure or because he had been useful to it. Caldwell reviewed the evidence again, this time imagining Avery not as a victim, but as a reluctant participant. The residues in his basement suggested contact, not manufacture. He might have been approached, shown something, perhaps even convinced that cooperation was a civic duty framed in technical language he trusted. If Avery had been assisting under false pretenses, his disappearance might represent a moment of resistance rather than discovery. He might have refused to continue. Search teams returned to the ravine near the annex. This time, excavation extended beyond the initial disturbance. Deeper layers revealed evidence of recent water flow inconsistent with rainfall. The soil composition suggested that something had been flushed rather than buried. The drainage system there connected to an old stormwater outfall that emptied into a marsh downstream. Divers were brought in. The water was cold, opaque, layered with silt. They found fragments of clothing fibers caught on submerged debris, consistent with Avery's workwear. There were no remains, no tools, no definitive cause. The implication was clear enough. Whatever had happened to Avery, it had been managed to prevent recovery. Caldwell felt the investigation tightening around an absence that was increasingly intentional. The operation behind the compound and the bypass valve did not tolerate unpredictability. Avery's behavior, His private monitoring, his repeated visits, would have marked him as such. Late one evening, a motion sensor at the annex triggered briefly, then went silent. The feed showed nothing, only a momentary pressure change on the bypass line. Someone had accessed it, but only long enough to confirm functionality. Caldwell authorized continuous monitoring. 2 days later, the compound levels dropped abruptly across all monitored sites. The injections stopped. This was not retreat, it was adjustment. The groundwork had been laid. Further testing was no longer necessary. Caldwell stood in the control room of the annex, listening to the low hum of equipment that had outlived its intended use. The operation had moved beyond her immediate reach, but its contours were now visible. It was scalable, modular, and designed to remain deniable. Michael Avery's role in it had ended when he became aware enough to matter. The case was approaching a point where questions would demand answers beyond the city's authority. Federal agencies were being notified. Jurisdictional boundaries blurred as the implications widened. The investigation was no longer just about a missing man or a compromised system. It was about an unseen architecture built quietly beneath the ordinary functions of daily life. And somewhere within that architecture, the decision to erase Michael Avery had been made with the same restraint and precision as everything else. Federal involvement arrived without ceremony. 2 agents from a joint task force were added quietly to the case, their presence explained internally as technical advisors. Their mandate was narrow, focused on infrastructure integrity rather than criminal resolution. But Caldwell understood what that signaled. The investigation had crossed a threshold where attribution mattered less than containment. The first actionable breakthrough came not from surveillance or forensic testing, but from finance. One of the task force analysts traced the offshore investment vehicle further than Caldwell's team could access. The capital did not originate from a hostile state actor or a criminal syndicate, assumptions that initially felt comfortable. Instead, it flowed from a domestic private equity fund specializing in infrastructure resilience and risk modeling. On paper, the fund invested in simulations, redundancies, and predictive analytics. In practice, it tested real systems under controlled stress. The dissolved consulting firms were shells used to penetrate public networks without scrutiny. Their assessments were never meant to be delivered. The absence of reports was itself a data point, indicating that the system under observation had not yet noticed the intrusion. The compound introduced into the water was not intended to harm. It was a tracer, a way to map real-world behavior under hypothetical compromise conditions. This reframed the entire operation. It was not preparation for an attack. It was rehearsal. The ethical line had been crossed deliberately. The fund's internal doctrine, obtained through subpoena, argued that legacy infrastructure could not be accurately modeled without live testing. Simulations failed to account for human response, bureaucratic delay, and informal workarounds. To measure resilience honestly, systems had to believe they were safe. Michael Avery had been an unplanned variable. His repeated visits to the annex suggested that he noticed the bypass valve shortly after it was installed. His private markings and inspection logs aligned with pressure irregularities associated with early testing. Rather than reporting it immediately, he monitored it, trying to understand whether it was a malfunction or a flaw. This delay mattered. It allowed the operation to continue long enough for Avery to be identified as someone paying attention. Records obtained later showed that Avery had been contacted through an intermediary posing as an independent safety auditor. The interaction was brief, professional, and framed as a validation exercise. Avery was asked to confirm readings, nothing more. The compound residues in his basement suggested that samples were shown to him, likely to demonstrate benign intent. He had been reassured with technical language he trusted. What changed was his response. Avery did not escalate through official channels, but his behavior shifted. His unscheduled visits increased. His phone showed location checks late at night. He began documenting patterns privately rather than through approved systems. From the perspective of the operation, this signaled potential exposure. Avery was not hostile, but he was no longer controllable. The decision to remove him was made internally, justified as risk mitigation. The Fund's doctrine treated human interference as noise that could invalidate data. Avery's disappearance was not framed as punishment or silencing. It was framed as correction. The mechanics were clinical. He was lured to the annex under the pretense of confirming a final reading. There was no struggle. Toxicology later inferred from trace evidence suggested rapid incapacitation. His body was disposed of through the stormwater system during a controlled release, timed to coincide with legitimate flow increases. The ravine disturbance was incidental, a byproduct rather than a grave. When confronted, the Fund's executives did not deny the operation. They contested jurisdiction and intent. Their defense rested on the absence of harm to the public and the long-term benefits of improved infrastructure resilience. Avery's death was described as an unforeseeable outcome of an unsanctioned interaction. The bypass valve was removed within hours of the operation being exposed. The compound injections ceased permanently. Internal reviews were launched. Statements were drafted. Caldwell watched the case conclude from a distance. Arrests were made, but not for murder. Charges centered on regulatory violations, unauthorized testing, and falsification of records. The threshold for proving intent in Avery's death was never met. Responsibility diffused across committees, risk models, and legal frameworks designed to absorb it. Michael Avery's body was never recovered. His death certificate listed him as deceased by undetermined means. In the end, the system learned from the test. Response protocols were updated, detection thresholds were lowered, oversight mechanisms were strengthened. Michael Avery became a footnote in an internal report, referenced only as an anomaly that altered data quality. The water continued to flow, clear and unchanged, through pipes that now carried the quiet memory of what it had taken to prove their resilience.